for everyone just joining us. We're going to wait till about 2:05 to get started to let people trickle in. But if you would drop us a line in the chat and let us know who you are and why you joined us today, that would be awesome. If you have any questions too that you'd like to get answered. And we will be recording today's webinar and streaming to Facebook. So I just want to let everyone know, getting the recording started now, and I will be streaming to Facebook in about 2 minutes. All right. Oh, we got a few people in the waiting room. Okay, we're gonna get this thing started. Welcome everybody to the Community Democracy webinar series hosted by Fairshake. We're excited to have you here, but before we get into the introductions, I want to do some quick housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar, and we're also streaming it to Facebook. And you'll be able to have access to the recording as well if you miss anything, or to share around to your community after this webinar. And we'll be sending that out at the end of the week. While Ryan's presenting, while I'm presenting, we ask everyone stays on mute if you're calling in from a phone, which it doesn't look like anyone is. So I'll skip that part, but it says it there. Also, if you can keep you don't have to keep your video turned off, but if you're having trouble with playback, feel free to turn your video off. That will help. Also, at the end of Ryan's presentation, we'll be doing a Q&A session, and the way to ask questions for that session is to either send me a chat at the bottom, just send it either directly to me, or you can send it to the whole group, or at the very end, you can raise your hand and we will call on you individually. We'll kind of make it like a conversation. So if you don't know what you want to ask during the presentation, just wait till the end, raise your hand. You can do that by going to the reactions at the bottom of your screen and clicking raise your hand, or if you do any of the reactions, I'll know what you mean. And then along the way, there might be some links that Ryan will be referring to, and I will be sending those out. So check out those in the chat. Yeah, and so we are Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services. We're a nonprofit law firm that promotes access to justice for people and their environments. And so we do that by providing legal services on an income basis throughout the Appalachian Basin of Ohio and Pennsylvania, and soon West Virginia and beyond. And part of what we do beyond the legal work is going beyond the courtroom. And that's why we're here today, to provide you with support and tools that you need to build the community that you want to see. My name is Josh Eisenfeld. I am our marketing director. And part of my job is to help connect people like you with our attorneys and allow you to get the services that you need. Today's presentation and is going to be done by Ryan Hamilton. Ryan is going to be presenting Building Your Community Through Zoning. And Ryan is one of our PA supervising attorneys located in Pittsburgh, our Pittsburgh offices. And Ryan is a wizard when it comes to zoning and land use laws, but he's much more than just an attorney. He's also an active member of his community. Ryan volunteers as a board member of Jacobs Creek Watershed Association, the Rachel Carson Trails Conservancy, and is the treasurer of the Solar United Network of Western Pennsylvania. He also enjoys the outdoors and even dabbles in foraging for wild mushrooms. I've yet to get the invite on one of those trips, but I'm hoping once this pandemic is over, we can do that together, Ryan. So that's my little plug for Ryan. If you have any questions afterwards, you want to get in touch with us, there's a few ways to do that. You can go to our website and contact us page, where you can, if you have a case you might want some help with or some further questions, you can drop us a line there. You can also stay up to date on what we're doing by going to our newsletter sign up page. And as always, we can't do this work without contributions from people like you. So we really appreciate the support that you've already shown us, and that you'll continue to show us in the future. So thank you for being here today. And we are really excited to share our presentation with you. With that, I will unshare my screen. If I can just move this in here. And Ryan, go ahead and take it from here.
Cool. Thank you, Josh. Let me figure out how to share my screen, and I can bring up our PowerPoint presentation. All right, here we go. All right, I think everyone can see this. Josh, I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm really glad that everyone was able to join us today. I see a couple familiar faces and names that I've worked with, and exciting to get to kind of continue our conversation today. The focus of our presentation is going to be on land use and zoning tools for community building. As Josh mentioned, I'm an attorney with Fair Shake. I've been working on land use, zoning, and other environmental matters in Western Pennsylvania for several years now. And part of this presentation is what I think I've learned and how my views on land use and zoning have been shaped by that work. As Josh mentioned, we're a nonprofit environmental law firm, and I think he gave us a great introduction, so I won't go into it anymore. The presentation today, of course, is for educational purposes, and if you have specific questions about a situation or about zoning for your community, I'd be glad to speak with you. You can reach out to Josh or I or one of the other attorneys in our office. So today, we're going to talk about, well, first we're going to identify this problem, right? The problem is how do I, as an individual or a group of citizens with, often relatively limited political power or financial resources, how do we influence the development that's happening in our community? Um, and one way we can do that is by participating in the zoning process. So to get started, we're going to kind of review a couple of basic zoning principles. I know there's folks listening in that probably know all about this already, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're going to jump into specific solutions for community building that zoning can provide. And there's sort of three goals that we're going to talk about, and I'll identify specific tools that pair with each of those goals. But the first goal is about conserving open space. So how do I ensure that development isn't encroaching on the open space and the other resources that we want to protect in our community? The second goal is creating public space. And what that means is how do we use the zoning process to ensure that the public has access to recreational opportunities, outdoor spaces, whether it's a trail, a park, maybe it's a sidewalk. It's creating public space. And then the last goal that we're going to talk about is incentivizing economic development. And of course, zoning is only one small tool to use in achieving this goal, but I think it's an important one. And in particular, we're going to talk about incentivizing what I've seen and heard from communities as what they feel is sort of beneficial economic development in these small communities across Western Pennsylvania. And then finally, we're going to talk about putting it into practice. What does it mean to, understand that these tools are available, and how do you actually have them implemented in your community? And then, of course, at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers, discussion. But if you have questions that come up while we're going through the presentation about a specific slide or a specific tool that we're talking about, feel free to leave a message in the chat, and Josh will interrupt me, and we can talk about it right then. All right. So the first issue, right, as I mentioned, is sort of defining the problem. And as I said, based on my experience as an environmental and land use attorney, I found that often when it's time to challenge a specific proposal, that's when we get a call for help, whether it's an industrial power plant that's being proposed, a large planned residential development, or even a fence variance. That specific proposal being put on the table at a public hearing in front of the community is often the sort of trigger moment that gets people motivated, gets people engaged, and often there's a desire to challenge that development for many different reasons. But the goal of today is thinking through how we can get involved in that process earlier on. And by doing that, how do we influence the development that occurs in the community before any specific proposal is ever on the table? And I think there's kind of two things that you need to do before you can even jump into that. That's identifying community goals and resources. By resources, I mean, what are you concerned about protecting? Is it a lake? Is it a park? Is it a stream? Is it a local school? Is it simply your residential home? Those are the resources that your community has that you're interested in protecting. And then along with that, you need to identify the goals of the community as well. So what do you want to see happen in your community, or what does your community need? It might be more walkability. It might be more bike lanes. It might be more tax revenue or more jobs. There's all kinds of different ways to identify those goals. And once we've done that, once we've identified resources and goals, it lets us shift from a very reactive approach to involvement in community development to a more proactive approach where we can focus on planning and incentivizing the right type of development. And one of the tools to make that happen, of course, to make that a reality is zoning, land use, and regulation. So we can talk a little bit about some of the basic principles behind zoning. It's a relatively new legal concept developed around the turn of the 20th century. And at its heart, it's about protecting public health, safety, and welfare. As communities develop and grow, that becomes more of an issue. So one of the first comprehensive zoning laws was actually enacted in New York City around 1916. This was in response to rising building heights. This was relatively new at the time, and these rising building heights were blocking light and air from reaching the sidewalk, from reaching adjacent lots. And from that, we know that zoning is often about trying to regulate issues that would otherwise result in nuisance lawsuits. But as we're going to talk about today, it can also be about much more than that. It can be about planning for and incentivizing your sort of reimagined built environment for the future. And when I say the future, I'm talking not just next year or 5 years, I'm talking about decades down the line. But of course, it all comes down to what is the authority of your local government to regulate zoning and land use. And in Pennsylvania, there's an authorizing statute. It's called the Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code. This statute delegates the police power from the state to the local government and authorizes them to enact land use and zoning ordinances. In other states like Ohio, where there are more home rule communities, that authorizing power might actually come directly from a state constitution. But every municipal government has the opportunity to exercise that power. Of course, not every community does. So in not every instance are you going to see zoning regulations in place. But where you do, there's really three main documents that you're going to want to think about reviewing to get a better sense of how zoning operates in your community. The first one is a comprehensive plan. And I consider this sort of a vision board for the community. It's a planning document rather than a regulatory document. And by planning, I mean the community is collecting data about historic land use patterns and anticipated future land use patterns. They're also collecting input from individuals and businesses in the community about what they want to see in the community. How do they want to see the community grow and develop? And that comprehensive plan puts that all together in a very nice format that's based on data and research, and it's intended to guide the actual zoning map and the zoning text, which are developed and which are actually hold regulatory power. So that zoning map, it's something you've probably seen before. It's usually a map of your township. It's divided often into different districts, sometimes an industrial district, a residential district, a commercial district. There's all kinds of different variations on that. But the basic idea is the map identifies what standards and what criteria apply to development in any district. And those standards and criteria, of course, are found in the zoning text. So anytime you're talking about major amendments, a major overhaul of zoning, it's often going to require a revision to the comprehensive plan. But those sort of minor revisions are more often found sometimes in the zoning map and very often in the zoning text. So you can get copies of each of those they're often available online on your township website. If they're not, you can often get them in person. Sometimes you can request them and the township will send them to you for a small copying fee. There's all kinds of ways to do that. But once you've got that in place, you know you know what the baseline for your community is. And the next step is thinking through, based on the goals and resources that you've already identified, possibly in your comprehensive plan. The next step is thinking through the tools that you have available for that community building that you want to engage in. There's many specific tools out there. You can write zoning ordinances tailored to a specific industry, like an oil and gas ordinance, or you can ensure that redevelopment isn't displacing existing residents by adopting some form of inclusionary zoning, which requires setting aside a percentage of new development for lower income occupants. So there's all kinds of different tools and approaches to doing this. But today we're going to talk about 3 specific goals and the 6 tools that correlate to them. So we're going to talk about conserving open space, creating public space, and incentivizing economic development. And the first one we're going to talk about is conserving open space with a conservation overlay district. So communities often use an overlay zone, which is a different kind of district in the map that we were just talking about. It's an overlay zone or a zone that applies more stringent criteria across many districts, but doesn't disturb the underlying standards in that district. And communities often use these underlying or these overlay zones to protect certain special features in their community, such as historic buildings, wetlands, maybe steep slopes or waterfronts. They can also be used to promote specific types of development, such as mixed-use developments or housing along transit corridors. And these overlays have the potential to be very effective regulatory tools because they tailor regulations to specific properties and specific districts to meet the community goals. In some instances, they can be more politically viable than redoing the entire zoning district scheme. So imposing this overlay on top of specific resources or areas where you want to incentivize certain types of development is one tool you can use. So for example, this image we have here it's a ridgeline overlay zone. And this was used in this community to minimize development in areas that were prone to unwanted soil erosion and groundwater contamination, and on sites that were otherwise difficult to develop in a manner that was safe and protective of the community's natural resources. So again, this is just one example of a type of conservation overlay district. And actually, we've collected a couple other examples. I think Josh has one of these that he'll send in a link to everyone. This is an example natural resources conservation overlay district ordinance from Schuylkill Township in Pennsylvania. And I'm not using this as a model or gold standard by any means, but I want to get the creative juices flowing and kind of put on paper some of the ideas that we're talking about. So I think this is a really good example for that. In Schuylkill Township, they used this overlay to identify and preserve streams, wetlands, and other hydrological resources, including areas of steep slopes and even wildlife corridors and scenic resources. So I think it's a really good example of how this type of overlay can be both very targeted at specific resources, but very expansive in the kind of overall conservation effects of it. So the second tool that we're going to talk about related to conserving open spaces is called a transfer of development rights. And what this is, it's a tool used to permanently protect land with conservation value, like farmland, open space, or other natural or cultural resources by redirecting development from that area that would otherwise occur there. This is known as the sending area, to a separate area that's actually planned to accommodate this additional growth and development. That's known as a receiving area. So in Pennsylvania, we're authorized under the municipality's planning code, again, to set up this type of zoning regulation. Of course, it's voluntary. It's not a mandate on property owners, but where a landowner does volunteer, it gives them the option to legally sever their development rights from their property in the sending area and sell those rights to another landowner or developer at another location in the receiving area. And then once those land rights are severed, that area is permanently protected with a conservation easement. And the area where those rights are received, they're enhanced because they're given flexibility in terms of what land use they're allowed to implement, maybe flexibility for density or height limits, or some other type of flexibility. This is probably one of the more complicated and challenging tools to actually implement that we're going to talk about today. It requires, an understanding of and setting up kind of the financial resources to allow this transaction to happen. You need to have partners, both whether it's the municipal government or something like a local land trust. You're going to need partners set up to hold those conservation easements. And you're going to have to get some buy-in from the residents who are in that receiving area, who are going to see that increased growth and development within bounds, of course, in their community. But it, in theory, can be a win-win, right? The landowner gets the market value of their land, developer gets increased value and return on their investment, and the public gets this protected open space. So I think it's one great tool to at least consider for your community. In some cases, it can be, exactly what's required. And in others, there might be another tool out there that's right for you. So I think that's all I have on the 2 tools about conserving open space. If there's any questions about those, again, feel free to put the question in the chat and we can talk about it. But if not, we will move on to talking about creating public spaces. So there's a lot of different ways you can create public spaces within a municipality. You can have public dedications of public space from a private party. You can have the municipal government actually go and acquire property for public spaces. But the third way that we're going to talk about today is making that public dedication an actual part of your zoning ordinance, a requirement for development, certain development within your community. And the municipality's planning code has authorized local government to use this type of provision since the late 80s. But in 2014, the provisions were amended to give local governments a little bit more increased flexibility in how they actually implement this. So I think, it might be something you've looked at before, but given those relatively recent amendments, it might be worthwhile giving this a second look at this time. So what this does is it requires a public dedication of parkland to be set aside and to offset the impact of any particular development, and to avoid takings claims or eminent domain claims. The local government or the ordinance is going to have to establish an essential nexus between the contributions that are being required of the developer and the public impact of the proposed development. and one way that you set up that essential nexus, it's actually, a requirement, is to formally adopt a recreation plan. This can be made part of the comprehensive plan. It could be a chapter in the comprehensive plan, or it could be a separate standalone document on its own. But in that recreation plan, you're going to have to identify the character of the municipality, the population density, the public demand for recreational opportunities, and as well as goals and needs for park space and recreation. And you're going to derive these specific criteria to ensure that the supply of parkland keeps pace with the supply, or with the community growth that's occurring. The municipality's planning code requires that any dedication of land must be reasonably accessible to the development that it's used to offset, and the location must bear some reasonable relationship, of course, to the actual future inhabitants of that development. So again, this is one way that a municipal government can encourage and incentivize the public dedication of land for recreation. And the next tool is kind of a very specific example of how that's being implemented. It's being implemented in some communities to actually develop these riverfront trails, and that can also be done through a riverfront access ordinance. This is, again, just one specific way that a community can ensure they're creating those public spaces. So we're not shutting off the public from accessing the sort of limited riverfront that we have, but we're creating a space that encourages, use and enjoyment of that riverfront by everyone. And in a riverfront trail ordinance, it's often written into both the subdivision and land development ordinance as well as the zoning ordinance. You're going to set aside space with every new development that occurs along the riverfront for a public trail. And that property is going to be either dedicated to the municipality, or there's going to be a permanent easement, public easement, imposed on that property. And often there might be ongoing maintenance requirements by the development property, along with possibly vegetation requirements, seeding requirements. There's all kinds of details that go into it. And actually, I think we have another example that Josh can hopefully link to all of you. Again, this is an example riverfront access ordinance. It's not the model, but I think it can get the ideas flowing. And this image here is from I think it's from Marietta, Ohio. We found that online. But this is the kind of riverfront trail that we're talking about. So, all right, with that, we're going to move on to tools related to our last goal. And this last goal is incentivizing economic development. It's something that, communities across the state, across the nation are thinking about. But in speaking with citizen groups and community leaders, I know that there's a certain type of economic development that we want to incentivize. And one type, of course, is sort of small scale entrepreneurship. So when we talk about that small scale entrepreneurship, very often we're talking about home-based businesses, but it could be other small businesses in sort of a commercial district. But overall, it's about trying to use zoning to remove barriers that would otherwise inhibit this entrepreneurship. So if your community allows for creative use of space, diverse income streams, and smaller options than the typical sort of standalone store, you're going to lower the barriers to entry for these small businesses. And of course, zoning is only one piece of that, but it's an important piece. The ability to work from home, prior to the pandemic, it was sort of the exception, right? Everyone had to go somewhere else to work. Your home is your residence, your work is some commercial business somewhere else. But I think for most of human history, and as we're seeing again now due to COVID-19, there's this increased interest in working from home, whether it's small scale agriculture or small scale manufacturing, producing goods from textiles to hardware, 3D printing, even food processing. These are all small scale businesses that can be developed either in a home or in another area of your community, as long as they're not violating any land use regulations. So typically, historically, land use regulations separated business uses and residential uses pretty strictly. But we're seeing now that people are more interested in kind of blending this retail, manufacturing, and wholesale business, often with their residential property being there as well. So, the ways we can do that are by designating home-based businesses as a permitted use, not requiring any further regulation of them other than the kind of standard nuisance regulations related to noise, parking, that kind of thing. You can encourage mixed-use development districts where you can have commercial or business use on a lower level of a building, but residential uses on an upper level, for example. And in doing all of this, I think it's important that we try our best to keep up with the sort of innovative business models that are happening. So over the last decade or 2 decades, food trucks have become a booming business. And cities across the country have struggled, I think, to keep pace with that, particularly their zoning regulations, which would otherwise prohibit you from parking your truck anywhere and selling food out of it. But now communities are adopting these kind of innovative zoning regulations that directly address that and allow for it and often encourage it. Another option to consider is allowing for temporary uses. So while that entrepreneur is getting maybe their small scale manufacturing business off the ground, you can allow for temporary commercial or business use of the property with some controls on duration and impacts. But ultimately, the way to ensure that you're not over-regulating, one way to ensure you're not over-regulating is to be sure that you're tying your standards and criteria to identifiable and measurable health, safety, and welfare impacts. A lot of times we see zoning ordinances that incorporate sort of, I would say outdated aesthetic concerns or other sort of unwarranted concerns about conflicting land uses. But I think when we ensure that the standards are tied to measurable health, safety, and welfare impacts, we ensure that the zoning regulations would be, number one, upheld if they were challenged, but also we ensure we're not over-regulating an industry and suppressing that small-scale entrepreneurship. And again, the final tool we're going to talk about is one example of how a community can inspire and encourage a very particular type of business, and that's a solar energy ordinance. Of course, zoning is only one of probably, hopefully, many factors that any developer or business is going to consider in deciding where to locate their next project. But I think it's an important one. And whether you're interested in encouraging tourism or recreation or a light industrial manufacturing, zoning is something that you should consider. Not only can implementing the right zoning tools sort of advance and ease the process for those types of development that you want to encourage, but it's also, in my opinion, somewhat of a marketing tool. It signals to the outside world that, hey, this community is ready to accept and support this type of development. Um, so again, zoning for solar is one example of that. And many communities that I've run into across the state will say that they don't prohibit solar development in their community, but it's not mentioned anywhere in their zoning code. And you know, in some cases that's okay, but in other situations it's really a gap in the code that needs to be filled. Um, because otherwise you leave a lot of uncertainty, and that's a problem for both the solar owner, whether it's a homeowner or a commercial facility. It's also a problem for the municipality if they're going to receive the challenge as well. So by explicitly defining what types of solar development are allowed in your community and how it's allowed, you can give that certainty that can really provide that, you know, final thumb on the scale to make a developer decide to put solar in your town. And if we look at this this national renewable energy laboratory study, we found that there's actually this strong correlation between higher levels of installed solar capacity per capita and references to solar in the local code. So I think, you know, this is at least one study for what it's worth that shows zoning codes have a direct influence actually on the amount of solar energy that's installed in any community. So when you're thinking about zoning for solar, you know, you're going to have to consider first what type of solar development are we actually encouraging? Are we talking about residential rooftop solar? Are we talking about ground mount solar? Is it commercial scale? Is it a municipal solar program? Once you define that, though, you can start thinking through the other factors that you want to address in your ordinance. Often, or many times, you might want to make solar a permitted use. So especially for residential rooftop solar, where there's really minimal impact on neighbors or other properties, you should make that process as easy as possible. Another factor to consider are building height restrictions. In some ways, solar can be stifled by building height restrictions, where building was constructed to meet the code, but they didn't give themselves any room to put solar panels on the rooftop, for example. So you might want to create or carve out an exception to that height limitation when it's purposely for solar installation. You might also want to think about solar access rights. And this means my right as a landowner to have access to solar energy and not be impeded in that by a neighboring landowner, you know, constructing a building or something else that blocks my access. And then finally, one of the sort of really interesting tools in the solar ordinance, often imposed more in a building code than a zoning ordinance, but I think it's worth mentioning, is a solar ready ordinance. And essentially what this does is it requires that any new development in the community be constructed so that it's ready for solar energy. They don't always have to actually implement the solar panels on the roof or whatever it might be, but the construction needs to be prepared for that, and it's intended to be sort of a plug and play opportunity. California, in fact, has done some really great work around this, and that's another example you can check out. Great. So I think we've gone through a number of different zoning tools to achieve a couple different goals in your community. But the most important part is actually participating in the process and working to ensure that those zoning tools are actually implemented in your community. So I started off this presentation by saying I want to move us away from simply challenging a specific development proposal. But I'm going to go back to that for a minute and say that specific development proposal is often a important opportunity to participate in the process. So even if you've only engaged when that particular development is on the table, up for consideration, that's still your opportunity to advocate for public space, for conservation. Often working with municipal leaders and a developer can lead to achieving these sort of mutual benefits for the community. So setting that aside, though, I think there are, even more significant opportunities to engage in that process prior to that. And the most important way, the way that I've seen communities have the most success, is to engage and participate in the election process. It's incredible how much power local government has to regulate land use and zoning, and how much that can shift and change over an election cycle. So participating in your elections, whether you're running for local council office yourself or encouraging other supporters to do so, I think it's an absolutely critical and important part of that process. But finally, the last kind of avenue for advancing these zoning changes yourself, whether you're an individual or a group of citizens, is to petition for the zoning change. The municipality's planning code allows for zoning amendments to be proposed by both local legislators, but also by community members. So for example, in my own community, a group of residents recently got together and petitioned to change our zoning so that residents could raise chickens in certain residential districts. I think they got together on Facebook, they collected signatures, they collected resources about zoning and chickens in residential districts. They packaged that up into a petition, and they sent it to their local government, and that's under consideration right now. So that's one way you can do it on your own. You can put that petition together, you can gather signatures, you can make that happen. You can also work with an attorney to actually draft a specific proposed amendment, and an attorney can help you through that process as well. But just submitting the petition is really only the first step of the process. It can often take months. Once they've received and initiated that petition process, a municipality has to forward it to the community or the county planning agency, which provides recommendations on the amendment. They have to publicize notice of a public hearing in a local newspaper. They have to notify the necessary property owners that would be affected by the zoning change. And if it's a zoning map amendment, they even have to post notice, visible on the properties that are affected by that map change. Then they have to make a public notice of an intent to amend the ordinance, and they have to make that ordinance amendment available to the public, whether at the township building or online. And ultimately, they have to hold a public hearing where the public is invited, whether you're residents or business owners, to voice your opinions, pro or con, for that zoning amendment. And only then, after this process continues for months, can they vote and officially adopt the amendment. So it's a long process. It takes dedication. It takes an understanding of, how some understanding of how political power is used in your community. But it's a doable process. It's something that happens all the time. And I hope that the specific tools we've talked about today, that we've shared, can be an inspiration, if nothing else, to think creatively about using zone to advance change and to build your community into what you want to see for the future. So with that, I I don't know if there are any questions, but I'd be glad to answer questions about some of the specific tools we talked about, or questions about Fair Shake or our work, or any other interests that folks might have.
If anyone has any questions, I don't have anything sent to me, so just feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
I have a question I noticed on your slide of the Riverside Trail, that there was no riparian district close to the water. And I wonder if you've seen Riverside trails where the riparian area is protected or installed so that it's also preserving wildlife and that sort of thing.
I think that's a great idea. You're right. I think the example that we shared was particularly focused on just the trail access, but this is, exactly what I'm hoping people do with this information. It sounds like what you're doing is sort of combining this public space riverfront access ordinance with the conservation overlay district, or some other type of, overlay that would preserve the riparian corridor to ensure that not only does the public have space there, but wildlife and the plants and other things that are important to the river ecosystem can be there as well. I think that's a great idea, and I can't think off the top of my head of any reason why you could not combine those two like that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
All right.
Well, if you think of any questions along the way, Ryan gave you some ways to reach out, but you can always visit our website and find our contact information there. We really appreciate everyone showing up, and we look forward to seeing you all the rest of this week. We have 2 more webinars at 2 o'clock tomorrow and on Friday, and hope to see you all there. Thanks for coming, and yeah, see you later.
All right. Thank you.